shall overcome. We shall overcome. Lord, we shall overcome someday.
So I wanted to talk to you this evening about my father's relationship with Martin Luther King. I'm probably not going to talk about liberation theology so much tonight. I decided I do want to talk about the whole question of prophetic politics. First of all, I'll start with that. Can everybody hear me? Is the microphone all right? Yes? If not, just signal me, yes? I'm interested in this topic of prophetic politics. What does that mean? But I will spend most of my talk this evening talking about my father's relationship with Dr. King because it was such an important relationship for him, and I think also for us, for all of us today, looking back. And I just brought you these pictures. This is a picture, of course, of my father with Dr. King, but here's the prior one, which some of you may recognize. This is a famous painting of the friendship of Moses Mendelssohn and Gotthold Lessing in the late 18th century in Berlin, sitting, playing chess. The Lavater is standing in the background. That's another story. But the extraordinary symbolic significance that Alexander Altman, for example, emphasized, the friendship. This friendship meant so much to so many people for so long. This painting is already from the mid-19th century. And by the way, yes, it was a friendship between two men because it's really, in the Aristotelian tradition, only two men who can have that kind of friendship. But there is a woman here. Some identify her as the maid and others as Mrs. Mendelssohn. I don't wonder about the distinction there, but she's bringing in the tea to the men, and I recognize that too from my growing up years. My mother brought the tea to the men as they sat and talked. But my point is really to say that this friendship, in some sense, has a symbolic significance of the launching of the modern era. The friendship between Mendelssohn and Lessing, and this picture too, this friendship between my father and Dr. King. And you might, I'm not going to go into it, but you might think about the differences between these two depictions. This is the famous march at Selma, which is a photograph that has meant so much to so many. But let me just begin with a few words about prophetic politics. In some sense, I can imagine my father saying, prophetic politics, two words that don't go together. Politics implies what the prophets oppose, certainly in my imagination of the prophets, and I would say in my father's as well, because politics, the word itself, has a rather negative connotation to us. It suggests somehow a politician, someone who is canny, unscrupulous, concerned with power, with oneself rather than with the good of the community, of the society, of the people at large, all of the people at large. A politician sounds sometimes like a con man, as we were discussing earlier today, a con man, a carnival barker, leaving many of us happy to be seduced, even taken in as dupes. My father writes, Isaiah could not accept politics as a solution, since politics itself, with its arrogance and disregard of justice, was precisely the problem. Perhaps we've gotten so accustomed to the mendacity of politics and politicians that it's as if we have a will to be deceived. But I think, in fact, we're not deceived. I think we know, but we disavow our own knowledge. We con ourselves, and we take pleasure in being conned. And that's precisely where the prophets speak to us about the problem of disavowal of responsibility, disavowal of knowledge, and the kind of gratification we perversely take in that disavowal. We Jews stand today at a crossroads that's clear to all of us. We stand at a crossroads, and I want to say how how pleased I am to be here at the Center for Jewish History, now under the directorship of my good friend and colleague, one of the outstanding historians of today, Professor David Myers, and how lucky we are, the center is, for having been able to secure him as the director. But we're at a crossroads, we Jews. We're at each other's throats. Sometimes I have the feeling we're cannibalizing one another. We are often our worst enemies, and we have to ask ourselves, what do we stand for? Politics or prophecy? Now let me just say a word about this issue of disavowal, and then I'll move to the relationship between my father and Dr. King. In a 1914 article, Sigmund Freud, an article, by the way, called Remembering, Repeating, and Working Through, Freud writes that people put into action what they don't want to remember. Action, he implies, is a form of disavowal, or perhaps an attempt to avoid our awareness of certain thoughts or feelings. Well, there's a vast amount that's been written, of course, about avoidance, repression, sublimation. Laplanche and Pontellier have defined disavowal as, quote, the refusal to recognize the reality of a traumatic perception. And I'm struck by the centrality of the problem of disavowal recognized by the prophets. We can think, for example, of Madoff and of financial exploitation. All of our religions warn us against economic corruption. We all have strict laws, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, regarding banking, investment, how we treat others' money. And to violate those laws is to violate God's will. From the prophets, we learn that those who plunder and exploit, who cheat, who imprison, their heart is false, says Hosea. The face of such corruption nowadays, more and more, is disavowal, denial. Those who engage in corruption strive to hide their wickedness and disavow what they're doing. If they're not caught by the law, they think they're home free. Their success is based on their ability to hide, to live a life of pretense, a life without conscience, life as a lie. But wealth cannot mask corruption for the prophets. Jeremiah speaks directly to the disavowal of today when he says, quote, on your shirt is found the lifeblood of the guiltless poor. Yet in spite of all these things you say, I am innocent. Behold, I will bring you to judgment for saying, I have not sinned. Sin is more than an action, and its afterlife is more than feelings of guilt. It's precisely the disavowal of having sinned that lies at the heart of the prophetic critique. But we might go further with Freud's insight. More recently, an American psychoanalyst, Henry Smith, has argued that disavowal is all-pervasive and continuous, and precisely the site of gratification. He writes, in every analytic moment, patients gratify in action the very wishes they are analyzing, and in so doing disavow the work of analysis, even as the gratifications are themselves disavowed in the apparent pursuit of analytic understanding. I see disavowal at the heart of what Michael Ignatieff describes as the lesser evil, pragmatic compromise, a tolerated sin. Liberal states establish mechanisms to regulate the breach of some human rights, some legal norms, and allow their security services to engage in forms of extrajuridical violence in order to fend off or minimize potential greater evils, such as terror attacks on civilians of Western states. Drones, American drones, kill people designated as enemies without due process. Eyal Weizmann, in his book, The Least of All Possible Evils, has described certain forms of even humanitarian work as the least of all possible evils. But he writes, the lesser evil is the argument of the humanitarian agent that seeks military permission to provide medicines and aid in places where it is in fact the duty of the occupying military power to do so. And by providing aid, they save the military their limited resources. You know, the prophets don't speak about evil. They speak about deeds of wickedness, about human deeds that hurt other people. They speak about the absence of compassion, about blindness to human suffering. And this brings me to the work of the Israeli philosopher Adi Ofer, who urges us to recognize that Evil is part of the world, produced as a byproduct of society. We can't eradicate it, but we can work to prevent its proliferation, which requires not so much judgment as care, active care, to reduce other people's suffering. What is central to Ophir, and what sounds very prophetic to me, is to recognize that the responsibility for preventing evils, wickednesses, rests with each of us, as we're all simultaneously potential victims, perpetrators, and bystanders, and we mustn't disavow that potentiality. Now, I want to say there are also dangers to prophetic politics. There are times when the voice of the prophets may sound hysterical or irrational when we speak in their words. Suffering and victimhood are easily exploited for political purposes, as we know. There can even be a competitive struggle for recognition, an insistence on our own victimhood, our suffering, that we use to disavow our responsibility for the suffering of others. Hysteria can make us overwhelmed and paralyzed. Evil can be viewed as so widespread that it seems beyond our capacity, and these are all tactics of disavowal. Yet Adi Ophir writes, the denaturalization of evils has a crucial part in representing the possibilities of prevention, which in turn plays a crucial part in the preventative action itself. Evil is not natural, and disavowal is not acceptable. And these are the themes that I would identify in both Dr. King and my father. The issue is not evil, it's wicked deeds, and it's upon us to halt their proliferation and cease our disavowal. So let me turn to this famous photograph. Crossing Selma's Pettus Bridge, Edmund Pettus Bridge. The Pettus Bridge is named for a Confederate general, and it leads out of the town of Selma, and it's curved, which means that the marchers leaving Selma didn't know what was waiting for them at the bottom of the bridge on Bloody Sunday until they reached the crest of the bridge. This march took place a couple of weeks later, in March of 1965. It's become an iconic image in Jewish circles, and in, I would say, in American circles more widely. It's a multicultural, multi-faith mélange, a photograph that in some sense represents a kind of eschatological dream. Here's a religious Jew, a rabbi from a Hasidic family in Poland. There's a nun from St. Louis, black and white, Ralph Bunch, Reverend Vivian, Reverend Abernathy, John Lewis, Dr. King, walking arm in arm. Someone from Hawaii brought leis for them to wear. Marching, calling for Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act, protesting racism in Jim Crow America. My father and Dr. King met for the first time in Chicago in 1963. They participated in civil rights demonstrations. They gave lectures together. They went to Christian groups, Jewish groups, interfaith, universities. My father had arrived in the United States as a refugee from Hitler's Europe in March of 1940. He said he was plucked as a brand from the fires. He came to this country barely knowing English. Meeting Dr. King in 1963, and I remember it quite well in January of that year, was quite extraordinary for my father. It was an unusual friendship in those days. It was surprising for many people, and it was also inspiring. Continues to be. Two people from such different backgrounds, different countries, different religions, and yet they bonded. They bonded. What brought them together? What brought them together? How to save the soul of America. They read the Bible in similar ways. They saw in each other something very special, a source of inspiration for each of them. My father used to talk about Dr. King all the time at home. He thought about him. He respected him. He felt a bond of friendship that was very strong, and my father didn't have that many friends, I want you to know. Where they met in Chicago was a conference organized by the National Conference of Christians and Jews, a conference called Religion and Race, where each one gave a keynote lecture. They had known of each other, but they hadn't met until that point. Dr. King spoke with the title, A Challenge to Justice and Love. He spoke in a very straightforward way, affirming that the struggle against racism was an interfaith event. And I'll read you a little piece from his speech. He said, "The churches and synagogues have an opportunity and a duty to lift their voices like a trumpet and declare into the people the immorality of segregation. We must affirm that every human life is a reflex of divinity, and every act of injustice mars and defaces the image of God in man. The undergirding philosophy of segregation is diametrically opposed to the undergirding philosophy of our Judeo-Christian heritage, and all the dialectics of the logicians cannot make them lie down together." I read that passage because my father's words are so similar to Dr. King's. My father began his speech by saying, "At the first conference on religion and race, the main participants were Pharaoh and Moses. Moses' words were, 'Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may celebrate a feast to me.' While Pharaoh retorted, 'Who is the Lord that I should heed this voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go.'" My father went on to say that the outcome of that summit meeting between Pharaoh and Moses has not yet come to an end. "Pharaoh is not ready to capitulate," he said. "The Exodus began, but is far from having been completed. In fact, it was easier for the children of Israel to cross the Red Sea than for a Negro to cross certain university campuses." My father's speech electrified the audience at that event. His tone was passionate and emotional, and it was very different, strikingly different from the kind of dry, rational tone of sociological analyses of racism that were common in that era. James Cone has noted that in his book, The Lynching Tree. Rather than analyzing racism in legal or political terms, my father developed a theological approach that Cornel West has called the strongest condemnation of racism by a white man since William Garrison. My father declared in that speech, "Racism is Satanism, unmitigated evil. You cannot worship God and at the same time look at a man as if he were a horse. Religion cannot coexist with racism. It's a grave violation of the fundamental religious principle not to murder." Murder? Yes, because racism is public humiliation, which is condemned in the Talmud as tantamount to murder. One should rather commit suicide than offend a person publicly. My father viewed racism as mired in institutional social structures for which individuals are responsible. Quote, "How long will I continue to be tolerant of, even a participant in, acts of embarrassing and humiliating human beings? We worry more about the purity of dogma than about the integrity of love. What is lacking is a sense of the monstrosity of inequality." My father's speech was not just about denunciation. It drew on Jewish teachings regarding obligation. "Religion is a demand. God is a challenge," he said. "Racism," he said, "is a test of our integrity. A magnificent spiritual opportunity for radical change. What is at stake," he said, "is God. Reverence for God is shown in reverence for man. To be arrogant toward man is to be blasphemous toward God." Both my father and Dr. King also shared certain critical points of view. For example, they both were not too happy about Paul Tillich's definition of God as the ground of being. They felt it was uninspiring and helpless in the face of injustice. The ground of being, Dr. King wrote, was, quote, "little more than a subpersonal reservoir of power, somewhat akin to the impersonalism of Oriental Vedantism." They both thought Karl Barth's theology left, quote, this is Dr. King, "Barth left the average mind lost in the fog of theological abstractions." And both appreciated Reinhold Niebuhr's analyses of American political culture and his deep awareness of human sin and national wickedness. And both approached biblical scholarship with suspicion, feeling that the scholars were more interested in determining the chronology of a text than in elucidating its meaning. And in fact, I'm sure Dr. King would have agreed with my father when my father wrote on the first page of God in Search of Man that religion declined in the modern era, not because of the challenges of science and philosophy, but because the religious message became insipid. You know, I want to just mention that something that James Cone, C-O-N-E, in his book, The Lynching Tree, writes about. He compares my father with Reinhold Niebuhr on race, and he points out the passion of my father's writing, and Niebuhr was still rather dry, he said, until Niebuhr came to know James Baldwin. And then Niebuhr also became more passionate in his tone. But let's just keep in mind that my father taught at Jewish seminaries after growing up in Poland, studying in Berlin. He taught in Cincinnati at Hebrew Union College. The Jewish Theological Seminary was a rather small, circumscribed world. He didn't have any colleagues who were black, any students who were black. Everybody was Jewish. He didn't know James Baldwin. I don't think he ever met him, knew of him, of course. And yet the passion, where does the passion come from? Somewhere else it comes from his piety, comes from the Bible, comes from Judaism. Now, I want to just mention also that my father had written his doctoral dissertation on the prophets in Berlin. He finished it in December of 1932. To get a PhD, you had to publish the book, but how can a Jew get a book published in Germany? And Hitler came to power. Finally, after 3 years, it was published in Poland, and then he had to get permission from the university that a Polish publication would be acceptable, and the dean kept writing to him letters and signed it Heil Hitler, horrible. Anyway, he wrote on the prophets and then wrote an enlarged version of that book in English, so it's more than a translation. And that book he completed and was published in 1962 in English, was issued as a paperback in 2 volumes, and Andrew Young and others in the civil rights movement have told me how important that book was to them, that they used to carry it in their hip pocket, and they would carry it with them when they went to prison and have it there as a source of inspiration. I want to just mention a word about the context. So we're talking 1963. The Birmingham campaign was underway during the first months of 63, and then in June of 1963, George Wallace, who was then governor of Alabama, this is June 11th, attempted to block the enrollment of Vivian Malone and James Hood at the University of Alabama, and federal troops had to come to force him to step aside. And that very night, President Kennedy delivered a major televised speech promising legislation and calling civil rights a, quote, moral issue. The next day, Medgar Evers, the field secretary of the NAACP in Mississippi, was murdered. 63, Dr. King was preparing for the summer of 63, August of 63, for the famous March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, a march that was organized by A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, a demonstration that President Kennedy was hoping to avert. And so Kennedy invited a group of civil rights leaders, including my father, to come to the White House for a meeting on June 20th, 1963. And my father responded to the invitation. This is what it looks like, but you can't read it like this. He sent a telegram in response, and I'll read you. This is June 16th, 1963. I look forward to privilege of being present at meeting tomorrow, 4 p.m. Likelihood exists that Negro problem will be like the weather. Everybody talks about it, nobody does anything about it. Please demand of religious leaders personal involvement, not just solemn declaration. We forfeit the right to worship God as long as we continue to humiliate Negroes. Church, synagogue have failed, they must repent. Ask of religious leaders to call for national repentance and personal sacrifice. Let religious leaders donate 1 month's salary toward fund for Negro housing and education. I propose that you, Mr. President, declare state of moral emergency. A Marshall Plan for aid to Negroes is becoming a necessity. The hour calls for moral grandeur and spiritual audacity. I don't know if Zvi is here just now. He gave a talk earlier this afternoon at our workshop about the prophets and the question of the state of emergency, moral emergency. It's very much in the spirit of the prophets. My father asked the president declares a state of emergency, so suspending, of course, human rights, suspending legislation and becoming the dictator and sending out the military, but this is something very different, of course. A state of moral emergency. It's a moment of violence. The phrase really is unique, and the language is very much from his book on the prophets. This march in Washington, as you know, took place in August of '63. There were representatives from the major religious and civil rights organizations. Rabbi Joachim Prinz was there as president of the American Jewish Congress. He was also a refugee from Nazi Berlin. He was one of the speakers, and he declared that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problem. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence, Rabbi Prinz declared. Dr. King, in his speech already in 1957, had said, "It may well be that the greatest tragedy of this period of social transition is not the glaring noisiness of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people." And my father wrote in the preface to his book on the prophets that the opposite of good is not evil. The opposite of good is indifference. And that in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible. Now, President Kennedy did not declare a state of moral emergency, and the clergy did not donate a month of their salary. If anything, tensions in the United States grew even more dire. Weeks later, September 15th, 1963, was the bombing of a church in Birmingham, Alabama, that killed 4 young black girls. And that same day, James Bevel and Diane Nash launched the Alabama Project that ultimately led to the famous march from Selma to Montgomery in March of 1965. I want to just mention something to you about this. I'll come back to the march in Selma, but I just want to tell you something that I experienced. If you have a chance to go to Selma, and I urge you to go, there are several museums that show photographs. The Alabama State Troopers took surreptitious photographs, thousands of them, and those have now been collected. They're on display. When I was first there, it was in the year 2000, and Joseph Smitherman, who had been the mayor in 1965, was still the mayor in 2000, which I found extraordinary. But I went to visit the home where my father had slept the night before the march. Dr. King had lived in this home for several months. It belonged to Dr. and Mrs. Sullivan Jackson. Dr. Jackson was a dentist, African-American dentist in Selma. His wife is a teacher, and they had a little girl, Joanna, who's now grown up. And that home has been preserved. The furniture is there. The telephone Dr. King used to speak to the president, for example. And Mrs. Jackson told me what it was like that day of the Selma March. I want to tell you this. She said that when she woke up that morning, she went into the living room, and there had been several people sleeping on chairs and sofas. And there she saw Dr. King standing and praying in one side of the room. My father was standing and praying in another part of the room. A couple of other people were praying in the other end of the living room and in the dining room. She was very moved by that, and I'm very moved by that. I think that's an extraordinary image, and it's an amazing room to visit. And I regret very much that when the film was made, Selma, and she's an extraordinary young filmmaker, and I admire what she accomplished very much, but I'm sorry that that wasn't depicted, that instead there was a scene in the kitchen with Mrs. Jackson cooking breakfast for everybody. But that image of everyone standing and praying in their own way, that was also something that Dr. King gave to us in the civil rights movement. It was just a few months after my father and Dr. King first met that Dr. King joined my father for a speech in the Catskills. It was a convention of conservative Jews, the United Synagogue of America convention. It was at the Concord Hotel. Does anybody remember the Concord Hotel? Yes, yes, I'm glad you do. I do too. Do you also remember Grossinger's? Yes, yes, me too. Yeah. So they went to meet there, and they spoke about race. They also spoke about Jews in the Soviet Union not being allowed to practice Judaism. They talked about Israel. They joined together. It was an amazing year, by the way, for my father, 63, 64, 65. Let me just tell you what happened in the fall of 1965. My father came back. Well, actually, all three of us, my mother and I, also went to Israel for 2 months. My father was invited by the president, Zalman Shazar, to give lectures in Israel to young people because President Shazar felt they needed a better understanding of what it means to be a Jew in a religious sense, not just a political sense. And so my father spent 2 months lecturing there. And he came back, and that fall my father was visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary, right across the street from the Jewish Theological Seminary. And that fall, in October, what happened? Nostra Aetate, this great statement by the Roman Catholic Church, was issued from the Second Vatican Council, and my father had been very involved in that. And that same month in October, my father founded an organization called Clergy and Laymen Concerned About Vietnam. And then at the beginning of November, he gave an inaugural address at Union Seminary called No Religion is an Island. It was this Clergy and Laymen Concerned About Vietnam organization that brought my father to encourage Dr. King to consider speaking out against the war in Vietnam. And I just want to tell you something. This was something discussed at our dinner table all the time, with guests or when we were alone. Politics were not about politics. It wasn't political. These were moral questions. Everything was a moral issue. It was an issue, should Dr. King speak out against the war? What would it do? Would it endanger his relationship with Congress and with the president? And was it morally right to encourage Dr. King to speak out? I remember as a child bringing that conversation to my friends at the lunchroom at school. Yeah, it was a very serious, heavy moral issue. And that's how it always was. The political is moral. I would say also that although the rhetoric of Dr. King and my father is moving and stirring and beautiful, it's not just the rhetoric of the prophets or even their message, their teachings, but that they were human beings, the prophets, with passionate emotional lives. These were people who knew how to pray and people who knew how to create powerful symbolic moments, and so did Dr. King and my father. I also wonder, and perhaps we'll talk about this further in the workshop, the English translation of the prophets is very beautiful, very rhythmic, very poetic, very dramatic. I don't think it's necessarily the same in certain other translations of the Hebrew. I had that feeling about German, for example, that it didn't have the same rhetorical power. Yeah. But the passions of the prophets were also reflections for Dr. King and my father of the passion of God. And their theological language has some similarities that I think are striking. So my father writes in his book, God in Search of Man, he says, God has a stake in the human situation. Man is not only an image of God, he is a perpetual concern of God. God never gives us a task without also giving us the ability to accomplish it. And during the Montgomery bus boycott, Dr. King declared, God is using Montgomery as his proving ground. He assured his followers, remember, if I am stopped, this movement will not stop because God is with the movement. In 1968, Dr. King said, it is possible for me to falter, but I am profoundly secure in my knowledge that God loves us. He has not worked out a design for our failure. It's not only that Dr. King integrated verses from the prophetic books of the Bible into his speeches, he also, like my father, transferred the current moment into biblical time. He spoke of himself as Moses on the mountaintop, and he described civil rights activists as a burning bush. He said in his speech, Bull Connor next would say, turn the fire hoses on. And as I said to you the other night, Bull Connor didn't know history. He knew a kind of physics that somehow didn't relate to the trans physics that we knew about. And that was the fact that there was a certain kind of fire that no water could put out. My father spoke in similar terms in the speech, Religion and Race, that I quoted for you, reminding, by the way, his audience that all white people were Pharaoh, including Jews. In another speech that he gave in February of 1964 called The White Man on Trial, at a conference in New York City, my father reminded the audiences that the Israelites left Egypt, and what did they do to this great miracle? What did they do after leaving Egypt and leaving slavery and crossing the Red Sea? What did they do? They complained about the water. What shall we drink? They asked Moses. Listen to the language. He said, this episode seems shocking. What a come down. Only 3 days earlier, they had reached the highest peak of prophetic and spiritual exaltation. And now they would complain about such a prosaic and unspiritual item such as water? The Negroes of America behaved just like the children of Israel. Only in 1963, they experienced the miracle of having turned the tide of history, the joy of finding millions of Americans involved in the struggle for civil rights, the exaltation of fellowship, the march to Washington. Now, only a few months later, they have the audacity to murmur, what shall we drink? We want adequate education, decent housing, proper employment. How ordinary, how unpoetic, how annoying. We are ready to applaud dramatic struggles once a year in Washington. For the sake of lofty principles, we will spend a day or two in jail somewhere in Alabama. The tragedy of Pharaoh, he went on, was the failure to realize that the exodus from slavery could have spelled redemption for both Israel and Egypt. Would that Pharaoh and the Egyptians had joined the Israelites in the desert and together stood at the foot of Sinai. I wanted to say a word for a moment, if I may, about my father's intervention into the field of biblical scholarship on the prophets. Classical biblical scholarship. We're talking about Germany. Germany is where biblical scholarship, well, really all of our fields, all of our disciplines, all great scholarship starts in Germany, 19th century, and certainly biblical scholarship. And it moved in different directions from the late 19th century to the middle of the 20th century. But there were some problems. What are the problems? We know some of them are famous. Julius Wellhausen set the stage by arguing that the prophets represented the high point of Israelite religion, picked up later by Jesus. But unfortunately, after the prophets, Israelite religion sank into priestly legalism and then rabbinic ritualism, legalism, Judaism. Judaism, he said, brought about the, quote, death of prophecy, suffocated it with its law. Other Protestant biblical scholars upheld Wellhausen's basic narrative. Rather than focusing on the ethical teachings of the prophets, they defined the prophets as ecstatics who were suffering from strange convulsions or fits. I think of Bernhard Doom or Hermann Gunkel. They lost rational consciousness and subsequently believed that their inspirations were divine revelation. Ernst Troeltsch, writing during the First World War, invoked sociological categories, defining the prophets as simple rural folk who appeared at the centers of political power during moments of crisis, and out of naivete, these prophets called for repentance and promised divine salvation instead of recognizing the need for heroic acts of war. I have to just tell you something. I looked at what happened during the First World War, and it's a problem. On the one hand, some of these scholars, both Christian and Jewish, and I think here of Hermann Cohen, who thought that the prophets is representing a universalism that encapsulates the message of ethical monotheism that defines Judaism, a demand to action binding on all human beings. And in fact, Hermann Cohen concluded that Judaism's ethical voice was, in a sense, the same as Germany's own, Deutschtum, Judentum. There you go. This universalism. But then they had a problem with the First World War. It wasn't so universal anymore. Now they had to support Germany and Germany's war aims. That was a problem for them. I'm being ironic. One has to be ironic. Look how ironic the prophets are. Isn't it marvelous? Look how ironic my father's voice is, echoing that irony of the prophets. What do we do with these prophets? Max Wiener, a German Jewish thinker, wrote in 1909, "It is the nation which is the concern of the prophets and the prophetic God." Zionists tried to claim the prophets too. In the post-war era, American Jewish discussions, the prophets reemerged, sometimes as figures of ethics or politics. The political scientist Michael Walzer has presented the prophets as political figures, as critics of the state, presenting, quote, an abnormal politics that is sometimes admirable and sometimes not, he says. And in his book on the prophets, the conservative commentator Norman Podhoretz presented the central message of the prophets as attacks against paganism. Kathleen Caveney traces the use of prophetic rhetoric in the United States in a variety of contexts. She says we need to recognize the place of prophetic indictment as a characteristically American form of religious and political discourse. But I would say that for my father and Dr. King, it was the prophet as a person that was so important. They recovered that personhood of the prophet, the inner life, the spiritual life. And they also made prophecy a claim to membership in a civic society independent of the state. What prophecy demands is an adherence to justice that transcends government, transcends society. Both my father and Dr. King spoke of maladjustment as the prophetic goal. So, for example, my father told an interviewer in 1972, quote, I would say about individuals that an individual dies when he ceases to be surprised. I am surprised every morning that I see the sunshine again. When I see an act of evil, I am not accommodated. I don't accommodate myself to the violence that goes on everywhere. I'm still surprised. That's why I'm against it, why I can hope against it. We must learn how to be surprised, not to adjust ourselves. I am the most maladjusted person in society, he said. And listen to Dr. King, very similar, 1957 speech. He used similar words. Dr. King said, I never intend to adjust myself to an economic system that will take necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the classes. I never intend to adjust myself to the madness of militarism and the self-defeating effects of physical violence. And my friends, I call upon you to be maladjusted to all these things. For you see, it may be that the salvation of the world lies in the hands of the maladjusted. The challenge of this hour is to be maladjusted. Yes, as maladjusted as the prophet Amos, who was in the midst of the tragic injustices of his day and could cry out in words that echo across the generations, let judgment run down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. The world is in desperate need of such maladjustment. And through such courageous maladjustment, we will be able to emerge from the bleak and desolate midnight of man's inhumanity to man into the bright and glittering daybreak of freedom and justice. The civil rights movement introduced also another dimension of prophecy, not only the words, but the prophecy of the voice, of the body, of action. What generated the power of the movement was not only the prophetic rhetoric, which was rooted, of course, in the preaching of the Black Christian tradition. And my father used to say, if there's any hope for Judaism in America, it lies with the Black church. But it's also the use of the body, responding to violence with nonviolence. The body became the symbolic representation of prophecy. The symbol is actor in its assertion of nonviolence, a formidable act of silent Jeremiah against the moral rot of racism. Susie Linfield concludes her book, The Cruel Radiance, Photography and Political Violence, with a question posed by the photographer Gilles Perez, asking, how do you make the unseen seen? The presence of the nonviolent body, sitting, marching, made the teachings visible. The passion of the prophets, heard in the passion of the words and voices of Dr. King and my father, made the inner religious lives also palpable. Dr. King's, my father's, inner religious life, and that of the prophets. One of the innovations of my father's book on the prophets was his investigation of the nature of prophetic consciousness. What does it mean to be a prophet? What's the experience? He wrote that the prophet's ear perceives the silent sigh, the silent sigh. They give voice to the silent scream, that which is unheard, unseen, that the prophets are in agony over injustice, while the rest of us are merely discomfited or upset in passing. Jeremiah, he writes, was a soul in pain, stern with gloom, with terror in his soul. He says, God is raging in the prophet's words, and to hear that divine rage means an end to complacency and to the other impossibility of indifference. There's a claim of prophecy that is made upon us as listeners. It assumes a mutual commitment to human life that's prior to the political, the human contract that's prior to the social contract that's necessary to constitute it. Prophetic speech is not simply to be admired. We're not supposed to simply focus on the rhetoric of it. The prophet speaks to engage us ethically, to make it clear that we have a moral obligation to respond, not simply to the prophet, but to those who stand in suffering as a consequence of our immoral society. Prophecy is anchored in a civic duty. We don't simply listen to the prophet, we're compelled by the prophet, compelled to act. Because fundamental to prophecy is the awareness that we stand continually before choices that are framed for us by society and by the state. What my father and Dr. King tried to do was to create a bond among us, all of us, an interfaith bond, rooted in a commitment to a moral demand that stands apart from the laws of the state. Dr. King spoke of a beloved community, and that's a moral community, recognizing that that bond of justice is prior to the state. This may be an alternative kind of citizenship, this beloved community, a community of nonviolence seeking to overcome what King identified as the state's three evils of this state, of poverty, racism, militarism. My father spoke about two central pillars of prophecy, divine pathos and prophetic sympathy. Divine pathos coming from that old rabbinic concept of tzorach gavoha, of a divine need. What does he mean? God needs us. God responds to us, to human deeds, to human experience. What's prophetic sympathy? The ability to hold God and human beings together in one thought, at one moment, together simultaneously. So about Jeremiah, my father wrote, standing before the people, Jeremiah pleaded for God. And standing before God, he pleaded for the people. Exploring the subjectivity, the consciousness of the prophet, led my father to recognize the agency that it prompts. That is, the prophet's subjectivity demands action. Quote, the ultimate purpose of the prophet is not to be inspired, but to inspire the people. The prophet stands within the state, but apart from state power. Prophecy is rooted in the assumption that we have a moral bond that constitutes us as human beings. And what the civil rights movement recognized was that the state's understanding of the human had to be challenged and overturned. Yes, racism is Satanism, unmitigated evil. These statements weren't simply rhetorical. This is not about a contemplation, but a demand for reorienting the moral self and considering the actions that we take or fail to take, that which we do as our responsibility or disavow. The demand is directed both to the individual and to the entire society, and the two are bound together in the prophetic tradition. We can't have one without the other. We don't exist as independent individuals. With Israel's distress came the affliction of God, my father writes. Dr. King writes, the God we worship is not some Aristotelian unmoved mover who merely contemplates upon himself. He is not merely a self-knowing God, but an other-loving God who forever works through history for the establishment of his kingdom. It's interesting, my father used similar language. God is not the unmoved mover, but the most moved mover. Let me conclude. Were Dr. King and my father the prophets of America? Of course, neither one claimed the title for themselves, but they spoke of each other as the prophet. Dr. King came to a convention of conservative rabbis in March of 1968. It was 10 days before he was assassinated, the last time that I had the opportunity to meet him and my father saw him. He came to this convention. Can I tell you for a moment about it, what happened? So I think I also have some pictures. This is at Arlington National Cemetery protesting the war in Vietnam. Also this. I'll come back to this in just a moment. But here they are. So this was at the Concord Hotel at this convention. And there were about 1,000 rabbis and their wives, no women rabbis in those days. And after dinner, we all went into the auditorium. And when Dr. King came in the room, we linked arms, because this is how we did it those days, and we sang, "We Shall Overcome," in Hebrew. And Dr. King said he had been all over the world and heard "We Shall Overcome" in so many languages, but this was the first time in Hebrew. And there they were, the Concord Hotel. My father introduced Dr. King that evening by saying, "Where in America do we hear a voice like the voice of the prophets of Israel? Martin Luther King is a sign that God has not forsaken the United States of America. God has sent him to us. His presence is the hope of America. His mission is sacred, his leadership of supreme importance to every one of us." And Dr. King, when he came up to the podium to speak, said that my father is indeed a truly great prophet. Here and there we find those who refuse to remain silent behind the safe security of stained glass windows, and they are forever seeking to make the great ethical insights of our Judeo-Christian heritage relevant in this day and in this age. I feel that Rabbi Heschel is one of the persons who is relevant at all times, always standing with prophetic insights to guide us through these difficult days. I want to say a last word to you about that march in Selma. You know, when my father came back from Selma, maybe some of you know, he wrote in a diary, and this is what he wrote. He said, "I thought of having walked with Hasidic Rebbes on various occasions. I felt a sense of the holy in what I was doing. Dr. King expressed several times to me his appreciation. He said, 'I cannot tell you how much your presence means to us. You cannot imagine how often Reverend C.T. Vivian and I speak about you.' Dr. King said to me that this was the greatest day in his life and the most important civil rights demonstration. I felt again what I have been thinking about for years. The Jewish religious institutions have again missed a great opportunity, namely to interpret the civil rights movement in terms of Judaism. The vast majority of Jews participating actively in it are totally unaware of what the movement means in terms of the prophetic traditions." My father said, "I felt my legs were praying." What does he mean by this? You notice he says it reminded him of walking with Hasidic Rebbes in Europe. And you know, in Hasidism, everything you do has a religious significance. Eating on Shabbat is a way of healing your soul from depression, according to the Abderav, for example. To walk with the Rebbe, to experience the presence of a Rebbe, you can turn the most quotidian moment into something religious, to feel a sense of the holy. What does he mean by saying, "I felt my legs were praying"? What's the relationship between prophecy and prayer? Is a prophet praying? And when we pray, are we acting also in a prophetic tradition, coming before God? For my father, it was a Hasidic experience. But notice something else. The Kabbalistic tradition, the Hasidic tradition, speaks about the way we can influence God, this tzorach gavoha, to meet the divine need. Through our religious acts, we say, before we make a prayer, before we make Kiddush, for example, we say, L'shem yichud kuchabrichu shchinte, that we may unite God, the feminine, masculine aspects of God, with this prayer. My father took that teaching and he expanded it. It's not only the Jewish obligation, the mitzvot that we do, the commandments that we do, that are what we call between God and a human being, but also those commandments that have to do with human beings enacting with one another. Ben adam l'chaveiro, that is, all the social obligations that are also part of Jewish law. He expanded that. That also was for God, for this tzorach gavoha. That occasion at the Concord Hotel in March of 1968 was the last time they met, but I know that theirs was a friendship that existed in their hearts and in their minds all the time, whether they were in the same room or not. They communicated. Let me just conclude by mentioning how important their friendship has been. I remember in 1984 when Jesse Jackson, Reverend Jackson, addressed the Democratic National Convention on live television to ask forgiveness for having made an anti-Jewish comment a few years earlier. And he invoked the friendship that's become this American icon. He said, "We are bound by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Heschel, crying out from their graves for us to reach common ground." So their friendship has had an extraordinary afterlife as a profound inspiration for reconciliation across immense gulfs, a source of hope to transcend the fraught political map that we now face in this country and around the world. Their friendship is a reminder of a great moment when these two men, with radically different backgrounds, crossed what seemed at that time to most people immense gulfs of color, religion, identity, gender, political orientation. Standing side by side, the photographs of them together are reprinted in publications about Black-Jewish relations, and their friendship calls for us to have a vision of hope and transcendence of political conflict, a hope that we very much need in this day. Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.